A mind of unimaginable power has crossed into a galaxy torn apart by endless war. In a universe where loyalty is tested by fire, psychic might is feared, and chaos lurks behind every star, one human telepath could change the balance of everything. What happens when the X-Men's greatest mind meets the brutal, unforgiving reality of Warhammer 40K? Brace yourself for a clash of intellect, power, and destiny that could reshape the galaxy forever. Professor X, the legendary telepath and leader of the X-Men, found himself in a universe unlike anything he had ever known. The moment his consciousness adjusted to the strange energies around him, he realized he was no longer in his familiar world of mutants and human conflicts. Instead, he stood amidst an environment of unrelenting darkness, immense scale, and a pervasive sense of despair. The skies above were a swirling mass of ash and fire, streaked with unnatural lightning, and the distant horizons were dotted with enormous fortresses that seemed to pierce the clouds. The very air carried a weight that pressed against his mind, a psychic resonance unlike any he had felt before, filled with fear, hatred, and desperation. This was the grimdark universe of Warhammer 40K, a place where war was eternal and the value of life was measured only by survival or conquest. Even his powerful telepathy, honed over decades to sense the thoughts and emotions of mutants and humans alike, struggled to penetrate the mental haze that permeated this realm. There were echoes of countless lives, millions of voices, all layered with fear, anger, ambition, and despair, creating a psychic tumult that felt almost physical in its intensity. Professor X took a moment to center himself, reaching out with his mind to sense the nature of this new world. His psychic awareness flared as he tried to reach the nearest sentient minds, but what he found was both fascinating and horrifying. There were humans, yes, but unlike the ones he had known. They were clad in armor, moving with rigid discipline, their minds hardened by constant battle and indoctrination. He sensed devotion and fear intertwined in equal measure, their thoughts almost entirely consumed by loyalty to a distant and unseen figure known as the Emperor. These humans were warriors, trained from childhood to wage endless war across star systems, and their lives were defined by obedience, duty, and survival. Professor X's heart ached at the thought of such rigid control. Yet he also recognized the strength and resilience that had been forged by these harsh circumstances. He could feel the immense psychic power radiating from some of them, hints of latent abilities that had been suppressed or channeled into rigid hierarchies. As he moved through this alien landscape, he began to sense other, darker presences. These were minds corrupted by malevolence, entities that thrived on chaos and suffering. Their psychic signatures were jagged and overwhelming, filled with malice and intent to dominate. He realized immediately that these beings were not like anything he had encountered before. Not mutants, not humans, not even the sentient predators of his home world. They were creatures of pure corruption, feeding on pain, fear, and despair, and their reach extended far beyond the physical into the very warp of reality. Professor X instinctively knew that these entities posed a threat on a scale far greater than any he had faced. They were able to twist the minds of others, infecting the weak-willed and turning them into instruments of destruction. He felt a chill at the thought of confronting such forces, knowing that his usual methods of negotiation, persuasion, and careful mental probing might not suffice, despite the overwhelming odds. Professor X's mind remained calm, disciplined, and focused. He began to analyze his surroundings with precision, studying the architecture and layout of this strange world. Massive spires and cathedrals dominated the skyline, built from dark stone and metal, etched with symbols of faith and authority. Entire cities were enclosed within towering walls, the streets below filled with troops, vehicles, and strange machines of war. The scale of everything was enormous, reflecting a civilization that had mastered technology and psychic power, but had done so through a culture of unrelenting militarism. He sensed both awe and fear in the minds of those he passed, though none truly understood him. To them, he was a foreign presence, a figure of mystery, and perhaps even a threat. Professor X realized he would need to tread carefully, for even the smallest misstep could trigger suspicion or hostility. As he delved deeper into the psychic landscape of this universe, he encountered pockets of resistance, rebels who struggled against the might of the Imperium or other oppressive forces. Their thoughts were raw, chaotic, and desperate, filled with hope and fear in equal measure. Professor X felt a connection with them immediately, understanding their desire for freedom and the drive to survive in an unforgiving universe. He extended his mind carefully, offering glimpses of clarity, reassurance, and strategic insight, helping them to focus their efforts without directly imposing his will. It was a delicate balance, for in this world, even the smallest psychic influence could be detected and misinterpreted, potentially drawing the attention of powerful entities who would see him as a threat. As he continued to explore, he also became aware of the immense psychic currents that flowed through this galaxy. Known as the warp, unlike any telepathic energy he had known, the warp was chaotic, unpredictable, and dangerous, capable of manifesting thoughts into reality, but at great risk. Professor X sensed both opportunity and peril in this realm. The warp could amplify his abilities beyond what he had previously imagined, but it could also consume him if he were not careful. He began to study its patterns, searching for safe channels and observing the influence it had on various factions and entities. He realized that mastery of the warp, or at least the ability to navigate it safely, would be crucial to surviving and influencing this universe. Amidst this vast psychic and physical landscape, Professor X contemplated his role. He was a man accustomed to leadership, diplomacy, and guidance, but this universe demanded a different approach. Survival required understanding the brutal hierarchies, the immense armies, and the constant threats from both within and without. He sensed the potential for alliances, both fragile and strong, with those whose goals aligned with his vision of protecting life and promoting stability. Yet he also understood that deception, secrecy, and strategy would be necessary in ways he had never employed before. He would need to balance his innate morality with the harsh realities of this grimdark universe, finding a path that allowed him to make a difference without being immediately destroyed by forces far more ruthless than those he had faced on Earth. Every step he took, every mind he touched, revealed layers of complexity, danger, and opportunity. The humans, aliens, and demonic entities all existed in a delicate balance, and his presence was an anomaly, a new variable that could tip that balance in unforeseen ways. Professor X could sense the immense weight of responsibility, knowing that even small actions could have galaxy-wide consequences. Yet despite the challenges, his resolve was unwavering. His powers, intellect, and experience would allow him to adapt, to influence events, and to navigate a universe where the rules of morality, strategy, and psychic engagement were far more extreme than anything he had previously encountered. The moment Professor X's presence registered in the Warhammer 40K universe, the Imperium of man's psychic and political senses began to stir with awareness. Though he had only just arrived, his psychic signature was immediately detectable to those attuned to the subtle threads of thought, emotion, and power that flowed through humanity on a galactic scale. The Imperium, vast, sprawling, and paranoid, was always vigilant for anomalies, especially those of psychic nature. The Astronomicon, powered by the Emperor's will, projected its light across the galaxy and through it. Imperial psychers and navigators began to perceive a strange, unfamiliar mind weaving through the immensity of the warp. It was not subtle. Professor X's telepathy radiated with clarity, control, and depth far beyond what most Imperial psychers could fathom, and this alone caused immediate concern. Those tasked with guarding humanity against heresy, mutation, and chaos influence reacted instinctively. their mental alarms flaring in response to a presence that could rival the strongest. Sanctioned psychers of the Imperium, within the citadels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the chief organization responsible for training and regulating Imperial psychers. The sensation was electric. Psychers in training paused mid-meditation, sensing the resonance of a mind that was ordered, disciplined, and vastly powerful. The more experienced psychers, those who had survived countless warp journeys and encounters with demonic entities, felt a mixture of awe and unease. They could recognize the sophistication of this telepathy, a precision and clarity that reminded them of the Emperor's own psychic might, yet it was distinctly alien. They whispered among themselves, communicating through the limited but potent mental linkages permitted to sanctioned psychers, discussing what sort of anomaly could possess such uncorrupted power. There was a consensus that this was no ordinary psychic being. Some feared that it might be an agent of the ruinous powers, cunningly disguised to infiltrate humanity. Others argued that the presence might even be divine in origin, perhaps a fragment of the Emperor's will expressed through an unknown vessel, word, or rather psychic awareness, traveled swiftly through the layers of the Imperium's command structure. Rogue traders, inquisitors, and even high-ranking admirals began to sense the emergence of this strange mind. The Inquisition, ever vigilant and ever suspicious, immediately began deliberating on the threat level posed by such an entity. It was unthinkable that an unknown psyker, of such magnitude and clarity, could exist without either the sanction or the knowledge of the Adeptus Terra. They convened mental councils, reaching out across psychic channels to probe and analyze the anomaly, attempting to categorize it within their rigid frameworks of sanctioned, mutant, or heretical psychic phenomena. They debated whether it was wise to attempt direct communication, containment, or even elimination, aware that underestimating a mind of this caliber could lead to catastrophic consequences on a planetary, stellar, or even galactic scale. Meanwhile, within the vast armies of the Imperium, Space Marines and the various branches of the Imperial Guard began to register a subtle, though powerful, shift. Though these soldiers were not psychically trained to the degree of dedicated psychers, the strongest among them librarians and sanctioned command, psychers sensed a presence that was both invasive and enlightening. Librarians, who themselves were attuned to the Emperor's psychic energy, felt an unprecedented resonance, a harmonic quality that was familiar in its discipline, yet alien in its origin. Their minds instinctively attempted to probe the stranger, only to encounter a clarity and discipline that rivaled or even exceeded their own abilities. It was both humbling and unnerving, forcing even the most battle-hardened librarians to reconsider the limits of their understanding. Imperial command centers, fortified against both physical and psychic intrusion, detected anomalies in the psychic feedback loops that stabilized their planetary and fleet networks. Navigators who relied on the warp for faster-than-light travel began to notice slight distortions, currents in the immaterial sea that seemed to respond to this new presence. While the Imperium had long learned to cope with fluctuations caused by demonic activity or rogue psychers, the patterns they now perceived were unlike anything cataloged in the extensive records of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Librarium of Terra. It was as if an entirely new type of psychic signature had entered the galaxy, one that combined overwhelming power with an astonishing level of control and intelligence. The Imperium's response was methodical but swift. Orders were transmitted to fleets and planetary governors to increase vigilance, to observe for any unusual psychic phenomena, and to report anomalies through secure channels. Sanctioned psychers were instructed to remain on alert, prepared to either communicate with or contain the new arrival. Inquisitorial operatives and agents of the Officio Assassinorum were also briefed, though only in cryptic terms. The full nature of the presence was beyond their immediate comprehension. Even the Adeptus Astartes, whose battle doctrine emphasized physical might over psychic finesse, began to regard the arrival as a matter requiring strategic caution, understanding that minds of such power could shape or even destroy entire war zones before a single shot was fired. As Professor X moved, the Imperium's perception of him grew ever more acute. They did not yet know his intentions, whether he was friend or foe, savior or conqueror, but the very fact of his existence triggered a galaxy-wide alert. Every military, psychic, and administrative organ of the Imperium prepared to respond, guided by the twin imperatives of vigilance and survival. In this universe, unknowns were met with suspicion first, engagement second, and eradication third if necessary. The psychic resonance of Professor X had already marked him as a force of immense significance, and the Imperium, with all its resources, would not ignore it, even within the higher echelons of imperial power, including those who reported directly to the Emperor through psychic channels. There was curiosity tinged with caution. The subtle signature of his mind suggested not only raw power, but an intellect capable of profound strategic and ethical reasoning. It was a mind that could potentially alter the balance of power across entire sectors, challenge chaos incursions in ways previously unimagined, or inadvertently become a target for manipulation. Those who sensed him understood that this was a turning point, a new variable introduced into a galaxy already teetering on the edge of unending conflict. The Imperium's collective psychic awareness, from the most disciplined librarian to the most cautious inquisitor, was now fully engaged. Plans were drafted, contingencies considered, and the first subtle steps toward investigation and engagement were set in motion. Professor X's arrival was no longer a single mind appearing in isolation. It had become a galactic event, one that would ripple through the Imperium's hierarchy, armies, and psychers alike. His presence was a challenge, a mystery, and an opportunity all at once, and every decision the Imperium made in response would shape the initial interactions between this powerful telepath and a universe defined by war, suspicion, and unyielding vigilance. As Professor X's presence continued to reverberate across the Warhammer 40K galaxy, the forces of chaos quickly became aware of the anomaly. These were entities and powers that thrived on corruption, disorder, and the manipulation of minds, always on the lookout for potent psychers whose abilities could be bent to their will or destroyed to sow despair. From the twisting currents of the warp, whispers of a new, disciplined, and extraordinarily powerful psychic emerged, carrying hints of moral clarity and purpose that were foreign to the forces of chaos. Unlike the usual psychers they corrupted or destroyed, Professor X's mind radiated an unyielding sense of discipline, a mental fortress honed over decades of training and experience. The Chaos Lords, Demon Princes, and even the lesser demons sensed a challenge in him, a mind that could not be easily dominated, a mind that could resist their insidious temptations, and perhaps even turn the tide against them. The initial contact was subtle, as the forces of chaos often prefer to manipulate indirectly, infiltrating the minds of the weak or attempting to bend entire planetary populations to their influence. Through psychic tendrils that crept like shadowy smoke into the warp, they attempted to probe Professor X's mind, seeking vulnerabilities, hidden fears, or any trace of doubt that could be exploited. Yet each probe met with resistance. His mind was like a polished shield, each thought carefully guarded, each emotion assessed and controlled. The chaos entities recoiled at the precision and clarity, sensing that conventional manipulation tactics, the whispered promises of power, the exploitation of ambition or doubt would not succeed here. They realized that if they wished to corrupt or defeat him, they would need to escalate their strategies, using more direct and aggressive measures than they had ever employed with a single mortal mind. Within this psychic battlefield, the forces of chaos began to coordinate. Demon princes, each a master of mental domination in their own right, gathered their attentions on this new entity. They discussed through the warp, their voices echoing like a chorus of malevolence, debating whether to attempt corruption, ensnarement, or outright destruction. The subtlety of Professor X's mental defenses complicated their plans. They could sense that his moral clarity and empathy were not weaknesses to be exploited, but instruments of extraordinary power, capable of deflecting or even turning their influence against them. For every whisper of temptation they sent, they met with a calm, rational counterwave, a thought shield that deflected chaos and confusion, while subtly probing the minds of nearby humans to strengthen resistance. The psychic contest did not remain confined to the immaterial. Physical manifestations of chaos influence began to rise in regions where Professor X wandered. Corrupted humans, cultists, and demonic entities began to appear, drawn by his presence, compelled to act through the subtle tug of chaos manipulation. Cities and battlefields became arenas where his mind and their influence clashed. Professor X, aware of the threats before he even saw them, prepared to respond not only with physical intervention but with psychic strategies designed to counteract, isolate, and neutralize the corruptive energies at work. He reached out to those who were susceptible, using his telepathy to calm panic, instill clarity, and counter the seeds of chaos that had begun to take root. His intervention was precise, surgical, and terrifyingly effective, leaving chaos operatives frustrated at the inability to sway the minds around him. Chaos, ever adaptive, escalated further. They began targeting the humans and psychers nearest to Professor X, attempting to manipulate their fears and desires to create indirect vulnerabilities. A planet's governor might be subtly twisted into paranoia. A captain of the Imperial Guard might hesitate in critical moments, and entire populations could be pushed toward despair. Each act was designed to test his defenses, to find cracks in the otherwise flawless psychic armor he carried. Professor X, sensing the layers of manipulation, analyzed each psychic attack carefully, tracing the threads of corruption back to their source while maintaining control over the affected individuals. His ability to perceive multiple layers of thought, emotion, and intention simultaneously allowed him to act as both a shield and a guide, countering corruption, while fostering resilience and awareness in those around him. The struggle intensified as chaos unleashed demon hosts to engage him directly. These beings, embodiments of raw psychic malevolence, attacked not merely with brute force, but with assaults on the mind itself. They attempted to overwhelm his senses, invade his thoughts, and warp his perceptions. Yet Professor X's mastery of telepathy, combined with his unparalleled mental discipline, allowed him to maintain clarity even as their chaotic energies struck with devastating force. He projected waves of calm, deflecting psychic blows, redirecting the demons' aggression, and at times forcing them to confront the resistance of their own minions. It became evident that his mind was not simply defensive. It could turn the very chaos that sought to consume him into a tool of order, using precise psychic countermeasures to destabilize and disrupt the forces arrayed against him. Through all of this, Professor X also recognized the broader implications of his presence. The forces of chaos were not acting in isolation. They were attempting to influence entire systems, exploiting the fears and superstitions embedded in the Imperium's populations. He began to see patterns, the predictable ways in which corruption spread through desperation, ambition, and ignorance. Using his telepathy strategically, he intervened on multiple fronts simultaneously, guiding thoughts, reinforcing courage, and blocking insidious manipulations before they could take root. The ability to manage such complexity astounded even the most experienced Imperial psychers observing from afar. It became clear that Professor X's presence was altering the dynamics of psychic warfare across entire regions, challenging chaos in ways they had not anticipated. As he continued to navigate this perilous environment, Professor X began to realize that the forces of chaos, for all their malevolence, were not entirely unified. Conflicting agendas among demon princes and mortal cultists introduced vulnerabilities. Some sought domination, others wish to corrupt for the sake of pleasure or spite. By perceiving and understanding these conflicting intentions, Professor X could exploit the divisions without compromising his own ethical framework. He began to subtly redirect their efforts against one another, increasing confusion and reducing the effectiveness of coordinated attacks. Every psychic encounter, every manipulation attempt, and every strategic intervention reinforced a singular truth: Professor X's mind, honed through years of discipline and moral clarity, was an extraordinary counterforce to the insidious influence of chaos. His presence did not merely resist corruption. It actively undermined it, creating pockets of resistance, clarity, and insight in a galaxy perpetually on the edge of psychic and moral collapse. As Professor X's influence began to ripple through the Warhammer 40K galaxy, the Space Marines, the genetically enhanced warriors of the Imperium, started to perceive his presence. These warriors, bred and trained to be the ultimate instruments of war, were no strangers to psychic phenomena, particularly the librarians among them who wielded potent psychic powers in service of the Emperor. Yet the telepathic signature of Professor X was unlike anything they had encountered. It was not chaotic or raw, as is often seen with warp-touched psychers, nor was it rigidly doctrinal in the way Imperial psychers' powers could manifest. It was precise, disciplined, and profound, a clarity of thought that resonated with an almost unnatural calm. The librarians, who acted as both the mental guardians and offensive psychics of their chapters, immediately recognized the potential magnitude of his abilities. They sensed a mind capable of extraordinary feats, able to probe, influence, and manipulate on a scale that could rival even the Emperor's own sanctioned servants. When the first encounter occurred, it was during a patrol on a war-torn planet under siege by Chaos forces. Space Marines moved through devastated streets and crumbling fortifications, their minds trained to focus on battlefield awareness, tactics, and survival, filtering out extraneous thoughts to maintain peak efficiency. Yet as Professor X projected his awareness, even subtly, they felt it, a ripple through their consciousness that demanded attention. Some experienced it as a momentary clarity, a sharpening of focus that seemed to enhance their perception and coordination. Others felt it as a subtle unease, the sense of an intelligence probing, analyzing, and understanding them almost instantaneously. Librarians, trained to withstand and project psychic influence, recognized the signature as a formidable and disciplined mind, one that could not be easily swayed or intimidated. It was at once awe-inspiring and disconcerting, challenging their understanding of psychic potential and the limits of human cognition. The more the Space Marines interacted with the effects of his telepathy, the more nuanced their reactions became. Tactical squads discovered that their coordination improved under his subtle guidance, movements becoming more synchronized, reactions faster, and strategies more adaptive. This was not direct control, but a psychic harmonization, enhancing their innate abilities and allowing them to function as a more unified force. Even those without psychic training could feel the effects in a manner they could not fully articulate, a heightened awareness that sharpened instincts and reduced hesitation. Yet alongside these benefits was a persistent wariness. The Space Marines were trained to respond to threats with absolute decisiveness, and the notion of an external mind influencing their actions, even benevolently, was unprecedented. They approached this anomaly with a mixture of caution, curiosity, and professional vigilance, prepared to act should his intentions deviate from their understanding of duty and loyalty. Within the chapter halls and the sanctified libraries of the librarians, debates erupted over the nature of Professor X. Was he an ally to humanity, a powerful psychic capable of assisting the Imperium in its endless wars, or a potential threat whose abilities could rival or even challenge the authority of the Emperor? Some argued that his presence could be leveraged, integrating his guidance into strategic operations to tip the scales in battles against Chaos and Xenos alike. Others cautioned that any telepath capable of such influence could become a liability, unintentionally undermining imperial discipline or inadvertently spreading dangerous ideas among even the most disciplined warriors. These discussions were conducted through mental links and private councils, often with the Emperor's indirect awareness sensed through psychic channels, reinforcing the gravity of the situation. As Professor X's interactions with the Space Marines deepened, his telepathy began to reveal the complexity and richness of their inner lives. He sensed their unwavering loyalty, the rigorous training and indoctrination that shaped their identities, and the deep sense of purpose instilled in them from the moment of their recruitment. He understood the mental frameworks that allowed them to endure pain, fear, and unending battle without faltering. Yet he also perceived the rare cracks, moments of doubt or hesitation, hidden beneath layers of discipline, where fear or moral questioning briefly emerged before being suppressed. These insights allowed him to communicate subtly, reinforcing confidence and resolve, providing guidance in a way that respected their autonomy while subtly enhancing their mental resilience. The psychic interplay was not limited to individual warriors. Entire squads, even whole detachments, experienced shifts in coordination and perception under his influence. Tactical maneuvers became more fluid, defensive formations more adaptive, and strategic thinking more expansive, as if an invisible hand was helping them to anticipate threats and coordinate responses with unprecedented precision. Librarians in particular began to recognize that his telepathy could serve as a counterbalance to the chaotic and corruptive influences they faced regularly. In engagements with demons or psychic manipulations from enemy forces, the subtle clarity of Professor X's mind created a stabilizing influence, reinforcing resistance and allowing Marines to act with a heightened sense of awareness. However, the relationship was not without tension. Space Marines are trained to rely on hierarchy, discipline, and direct orders. The presence of an external mind, however benevolent, introduced an element of unpredictability. Captain-level officers and chapter leaders remained vigilant, monitoring for any potential misuse of psychic influence or unintended consequences. The delicate balance between enhancing their effectiveness and preserving the chain of command became a constant consideration, one that required careful observation and restraint. Professor X's telepathy, for all its sophistication, did not override their free will but instead complemented their decision-making. A subtle symbiosis that required both trust and prudence. As battles continued across war-ravaged worlds, the Space Marines' experiences with Professor X grew more pronounced. They began to see patterns and anticipate threats more effectively, as if the psychic resonance between his mind and theirs had created a form of collective awareness. Enemy movements, particularly those influenced by chaos, became easier to counteract, as his guidance allowed them to anticipate and respond with precision. Librarians, recognizing the tactical advantage, began to advocate for strategic cooperation, proposing coordinated psychic operations in which Professor X's insight could be integrated into broader campaigns. Through all of this, Professor Ten gained a profound understanding of the Space Marines themselves. He realized that these warriors were not merely soldiers. They were living embodiments of discipline, loyalty, and the unyielding will of the Imperium. Their minds were shaped to endure unimaginable stress, their perceptions honed to respond to threats instantaneously, and their resolve forged in centuries of war. Interacting with them allowed him to adapt his psychic strategies, calibrating his influence to respect their autonomy while maximizing their effectiveness. A delicate and unprecedented dance of mutual awareness that reshaped the battlefield in subtle but transformative ways. As Professor X's presence extended through the Warhammer 40K galaxy, the Eldar, those ancient and enigmatic beings, became acutely aware of his psychic signature. Unlike humans, the Eldar were a race whose entire civilization was intertwined with the warp, their minds and culture molded by millennia of psychic development and discipline. The psychic perception of an Eldar was both intricate and profound, capable of sensing not just the surface thoughts of a being, but the deeper threads of emotion, intention, and potential. When they encountered Professor X's mind, even across vast distances, they felt an anomaly that was striking in both clarity and power. It was not aggressive, like the raw, destructive energies of the warp that Eldar often encountered, nor was it frenzied or chaotic as one might expect from an untrained psychic. Instead, it was deliberate, controlled, and filled with an almost human empathy, a quality both familiar and deeply alien to them. The initial reactions among the Eldar, seers and farseers, were cautious curiosity. They sensed a mind capable of immense psychic influence, one that seemed to operate outside the usual rules of the warp, yet remained intimately aware of it. To the Eldar, whose civilization was guided by prophetic visions and an intricate understanding of fate, Professor X's presence represented both a potential ally and an unpredictable variable. Some of the more cautious farseers debated the risks. A human psychic of such power could influence events on a scale rivaling even their own manipulations of the webway and warp currents. Yet his moral clarity and disciplined approach suggested that, unlike most humans, he was not easily swayed by ambition, fear, or desperation, qualities that often made human psychers dangerous in their universe. As Professor X moved through the galaxy, Eldar listening posts and psychic enclaves began to track the flow of his mind through the warp. They perceived subtle harmonics that resonated with their own psychic energies, patterns that suggested a rare form of synchronization between conscious thought and psychic influence. It was as if his mind operated with a precision that mirrored the weaving of fate itself, yet remained independent of the prescriptive destinies that Eldar often perceived. Some farseers speculated that this might be a mind capable of altering the outcomes of events in ways even their complex predictions could not anticipate. This was both fascinating and unnerving. The Eldar had long prided themselves on their ability to foresee and manipulate the future. Yet here was a presence that introduced a completely new variable, one that could shift probabilities on a galactic scale. Interactions between Professor X and the Eldar were initially indirect, subtle, and cautious. Using their psychic senses, farseers began to probe the boundaries of his mind, not to dominate, but to understand. They discovered a depth of empathy and intellect that allowed him to perceive motivations, intentions, and emotional currents with extraordinary accuracy. Unlike most humans whose psychic abilities were often colored by fear, ambition, or desperation, his telepathy was disciplined and deliberate, allowing him to communicate and influence without coercion. Eldar found this approach unusual, yet deeply compelling. They began to sense the possibility of cooperation, a rare alignment of intention that could be leveraged in conflicts against mutual threats, particularly the forces of chaos that constantly threatened both human and Eldar domains. The subtle exchange of psychic awareness quickly revealed the potential for strategic collaboration. Eldar craft worlds, often isolated and cautious in their interactions with other species, recognized that Professor X's insight could help anticipate the moves of chaos and other hostile factions. His telepathy allowed him to detect patterns in thought, emotion, and behavior that even the Eldar, with their millennia of experience, found intriguing. Through this shared awareness, they began to see opportunities for preemptive action, the identification of hidden threats, and the coordination of interventions that could save countless lives. The farseers, who had long guided their people through visions of potential futures, began to incorporate this new, disciplined mind into their calculations, adjusting probabilities and strategies with the subtle influence of his telepathy. Yet alongside the opportunity for collaboration came caution and concern. Eldar have long understood that psychic power, no matter how disciplined, carries inherent risks. Even a mind as controlled as Professor X's could be vulnerable to manipulation under certain circumstances, and the unpredictable nature of the warp meant that external influences could arise without warning. Farseers debated how much interaction was wise, weighing the potential benefits of his guidance against the dangers of reliance on a being outside their cultural and psychic framework. Despite these concerns, many recognized that his presence offered a unique advantage, particularly in situations where the Eldar's foresight alone might not suffice to counter the machinations of chaos or the rigid militarism of the Imperium. As interactions deepened, Professor X began to perceive the Eldar as well, sensing not only their thoughts but the centuries of accumulated experience embedded in their culture. He realized that these beings were highly attuned to both the physical and psychic planes, capable of operating with precision and subtlety that rivaled even his own disciplined mind. Their foresight, strategic thinking, and understanding of the warp provided him with insights into the galaxy that were previously inaccessible. He began to communicate in ways that transcended spoken language, projecting concepts and intentions directly into their consciousness. This mode of interaction was initially disorienting for both sides, yet it allowed a level of coordination and mutual understanding that surpassed conventional diplomacy. The Eldar began to regard Professor X not merely as a human psychic, but as a being whose mind could complement their own intricate strategies. Through shared awareness, they could anticipate threats, coordinate responses, and adjust tactics with a speed and precision previously unattainable. At the same time, they were acutely aware of the anomaly he represented. Humans were rarely capable of maintaining such clarity and control under the pressures of psychic influence and the constant threat of corruption. His presence challenged long-held assumptions about the limits of human potential, prompting some Eldar to reconsider the boundaries between their species and the rest of the galaxy. As time passed, the Eldar began to integrate his insights into their broader understanding of galactic events. They recognized that his influence could tip the scales in critical conflicts, particularly against unpredictable enemies such as chaos cults, rogue psychers, and Xenos threats. Through careful observation and psychic cooperation, they started to explore how his disciplined telepathy could be used strategically, amplifying their own powers while maintaining the integrity of their foresight. Even among a species renowned for their wisdom, the presence of a human mind operating at such a level was both remarkable and potentially transformative, offering possibilities that could reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. As Professor X's presence spread across the Warhammer 40K galaxy, he began to encounter species whose very perception of reality was vastly different from humanity, and none were more bewildered by his psychic abilities than the orcs and tyranids. Both species, in their own ways, were alien to the structured logic and moral clarity that guided his actions, and both responded to his mind with a combination of instinctive reaction and confusion. The orcs, with their crude yet surprisingly effective communal psychic gestalt, perceived the arrival of a new consciousness that did not fit their crude mental patterns. Their minds, which operated through a mixture of instinct, aggression, and psychic energy known as the WUG, were accustomed to domination through sheer force, simple mental impressions, and collective reinforcement. The subtle, disciplined, and precise telepathy of Professor X presented a puzzle. Orcs were drawn to conflict and conquest, and any mind that projected strength was a potential threat or rival. Yet his mental presence did not scream domination, nor did it radiate fear or submission. Instead, it was calm, controlled, and assertive in a way that the orcs instinctively could not interpret. Many orcs initially reacted with hostility. Their psychic impressions attempted to grasp his intentions through crude mental probing, seeking weakness, aggression, or fear to exploit. When they encountered none of these familiar cues, confusion spread through their ranks. Some orcs simply ignored him, unable to classify the sensation. Others, particularly the more powerful warbosses or weirdboy shamans, attempted to assert dominance psychically, projecting the collective psychic aggression of the Wog toward him. However, Professor X's mind was like a fortress, absorbing and redirecting these crude waves with effortless precision. The weirdboys found themselves pushed back, not physically, but psychologically, as their chaotic mental energy failed to penetrate his defenses. Even in the midst of violent engagement, his ability to sense intentions allowed him to anticipate attacks, exploit gaps in their coordination, and neutralize threats before they could escalate beyond manageable levels. Meanwhile, the Tyranids presented an entirely different challenge. Unlike orcs, Tyranids were not individuals but a collective, consciousness governed by the hive mind. Each organism acted as part of a greater whole, with individual instincts subordinated to the directives of the swarm. The hive mind's psychic presence was vast, overwhelming, and alien in every sense. Professor X, accustomed to probing individual minds, or even the gestalt of mutant and human populations, suddenly faced a network of consciousnesses that operated simultaneously as both individual units and a single superorganism. The telepathic feedback alone was disorienting, a constant flow of predatory instinct, survival priority, and coordinated action that threatened to overload his senses. Yet, even here, his mind adapted. He discerned patterns in the swarm's thought processes, identifying nodes of command and influence within the psychic network. These focal points became targets for subtle interference, mental feints, and strategic redirection, allowing him to manipulate encounters without directly confronting the overwhelming mass of minds at once. In both cases, Professor X's approach was analytical and disciplined. He recognized that neither orcs nor Tyranids could be reasoned with in any conventional sense. Moral arguments, ethical persuasion, and appeals to cooperation held no weight. Instead, he relied on his telepathy to influence perception, anticipate behavior, and create openings that could be exploited tactically. With the orcs, he subtly amplified existing rivalries or focused aggression away from critical areas, manipulating the instincts of the horde to prevent chaotic attacks from overwhelming allies or innocent populations. With Tyranids, he exploited the hive mind's need for coordination, introducing minor disruptions in the psychic network that caused hesitation or misalignment within the swarm, providing crucial moments for defensive or counteroffensive measures. The psychological impact of his presence on these species was profound. Orcs, for all their brutishness and resilience, were unnerved by a mind they could not dominate or provoke. Warbosses found themselves questioning the limits of their psychic and physical dominance, sensing a force that existed entirely outside their comprehension. Weirdboys, accustomed to directing the raw psychic energy of the Wog, felt frustration and confusion at being unable to assert control over an external mind that radiated both power and restraint. Similarly, Tyranid organisms, which normally operated as extensions of the hive mind's will, experienced subtle disturbances in their cohesion. While individual organisms were unaware of the disruption, the overall efficiency of the swarm was diminished in ways imperceptible to standard observation but critical in high-stakes encounters. As engagements continued, Professor X's interactions with orcs and Tyranids evolved from purely defensive or reactive strategies into more proactive maneuvers. He began to experiment with mental redirection, nudging orc aggression toward mutually destructive targets, or creating illusions that led Tyranid units to expend energy on ineffective movements. These actions were not brute force. They were subtle, disciplined manipulations that leveraged his understanding of intent, instinct, and collective thought. The orcs, operating through a mixture of instinct and psychic gestalt, began to experience moments of disarray, brief pauses in their assaults as the unfamiliar telepathic interference disrupted their internal cohesion. The Tyranids, ever adaptive yet rigidly tied to the hive mind's psychic network, found themselves misaligned, units acting in ways that reduced the swarm's overall efficiency without ever fully realizing the external cause. Through these encounters, Professor X gained insight into the psychology of entirely alien species, learning to navigate minds that operated on principles vastly different from his own. His disciplined telepathy allowed him to maintain clarity amidst the chaotic psychic landscape, discerning patterns of thought and intention where others might see only confusion and instinct. In interacting with these alien species, he not only neutralized immediate threats, but also began to understand the broader implications of his presence in a galaxy teeming with minds that did not operate according to human logic, morality, or social convention. Even as he adapted to these alien intelligences, Professor X remained mindful of the limits of his influence. Orcs could not be reasoned with through moral appeals, and Tyranids could not be negotiated with. His interventions were tactical and psychological, designed to create openings, prevent catastrophic losses, and guide outcomes subtly without violating the natural instincts of these species. By mastering the patterns of thought and instinct that governed them, he carved a space for strategic engagement, allowing himself and any allies he might have to operate more effectively in environments dominated by aggression, instinct, and hive coordination. Professor X, having acclimated to the brutal and unforgiving universe of Warhammer 40K, recognized the potential for his telepathy to become a unifying force among the countless factions torn by endless conflict. The galaxy, a vast expanse of warring planets, empires, and alien civilizations, was defined by division, mistrust, and the constant specter of betrayal. From the Imperium of man to the scattered Eldar craft worlds, from orc war bands to the insidious spread of chaos cults, every corner of the galaxy was embroiled in conflict, each faction pursuing its own interests with little regard for diplomacy or cooperation. Yet Professor X, with his decades of experience in uniting diverse minds on Earth, understood that even in a universe defined by war, the potential for coordination existed through shared understanding, communication, and strategic telepathic influence. He began by reaching out, subtly and carefully, to those whose intentions and capabilities aligned most closely with the protection of life and stability. Within the Imperium, his presence was particularly impactful among the sanctioned psychers, the librarians, and the Inquisition. These individuals, already trained to perceive the intentions, fears, and desires of others, sensed a new level of mental clarity and control in his telepathy. Unlike other psychers whose abilities were often chaotic or vulnerable to manipulation, Professor X's mind offered precision, insight, and guidance without imposing dominance. He projected subtle messages of cooperation, emphasizing shared goals and the value of coordinated action, weaving a psychic thread that could harmonize the efforts of disparate individuals who were otherwise consumed by suspicion and rigid hierarchies. Across the Imperium, commanders began to notice a change. Tactical coordination among units improved unexpectedly, as if an unseen force was guiding decisions, smoothing communication, and anticipating challenges before they became crises. Captain level. Officers reported unexplainable clarity in strategic planning sessions, a sense that their soldiers were anticipating moves they had not yet ordered. While these improvements were subtle, they were enough to tip the balance in numerous skirmishes against chaos incursions or alien aggressors. Professor X's telepathy did not override command structures. Rather, it enhanced perception, foresight, and cooperation, allowing individuals to act more effectively while maintaining their autonomy. The Eldar, too, responded to his efforts in unique ways. Farseers and seers, whose lives were dedicated to navigating the currents of fate and psychic potential, sensed the extraordinary precision of his mind. They recognized that his disciplined telepathy could complement their own prophetic visions, allowing for enhanced coordination not only between individual craft worlds, but also between Eldar and human forces where strategic alignment was possible. Through subtle psychic signals, he suggested courses of action, highlighted threats, and shared insights into the motivations of enemy forces. Unlike direct control or manipulation, these interactions fostered cooperation built on mutual understanding and trust, a rare phenomenon in a galaxy where deception and ulterior motives were the norm. In the midst of these efforts, Professor X also considered the broader challenge of the orcs and tyranids, species whose minds operated through instinct, aggression, and hive-like coordination. While they could not be reasoned with or persuaded in conventional ways, his telepathy allowed him to influence the flow of their collective behaviors, subtly redirecting aggression or causing temporary disarray to prevent catastrophic outcomes. By stabilizing these volatile forces or exploiting weaknesses in their coordination, he effectively reduced unnecessary destruction and created windows of opportunity for organized factions to unite against common threats. This indirect influence extended the reach of his unifying efforts, demonstrating that even the most chaotic elements of the galaxy could be guided without direct confrontation. Professor X's attempts to unite warring factions were not limited to the psychic or martial realms. He also focused on the moral and strategic alignment of individuals. By reaching the minds of leaders, commanders, and influential figures, he encouraged consideration of longer-term consequences, the value of cooperation, and the necessity of strategic alliances. These subtle nudges were calculated to respect autonomy while fostering an awareness of shared interests. For instance, imperial governors and planetary leaders might hesitate less in coordinating defense efforts, while Eldar seers could adjust their interventions to support human forces without compromising their own long-term objectives. The careful interplay of insight and guidance allowed him to sow the seeds of cooperation across cultural, racial, and hierarchical divides, establishing the foundations of a network of coordinated minds, operating toward shared objectives. The psychic threads he wove were intricate and delicate. Any misstep could lead to suspicion, mistrust, or unintended consequences, particularly in a galaxy as paranoid and vigilant as the Imperium. He was acutely aware of the consequences of overreach, understanding that even well-intentioned influence could be misinterpreted as manipulation or heresy. Therefore, every mental impression he projected, every subtle suggestion or insight, was calibrated with precision. He reinforced existing loyalties, highlighted mutual threats, and enhanced the capacity for collaboration, all while maintaining the independence and agency of those he sought to unite. Even the forces of chaos, aware of his presence, were indirectly affected by these efforts. By fostering coordination among his allies, he created a more resilient and adaptive network capable of resisting the corruptive and manipulative strategies of demons, chaos cultists, and warp-tainted psychers. This increased resistance disrupted the usual advantages that chaos forces held over divided and isolated factions, forcing them to expend more resources, time, and energy to achieve objectives that would have previously been easily accomplished. Professor X's unifying influence was not a weapon in the traditional sense, yet its strategic effect was profound, altering the balance of power through the coordination of thought, perception, and foresight. As he expanded these efforts, Professor X became increasingly attuned to the mental landscapes of entire systems and regions. He could sense not only immediate threats, but also emerging conflicts and potential alliances. By projecting awareness and subtle influence across these networks, he began to preempt crises, foster collaboration among unlikely allies, and create conditions where cooperation became both possible and advantageous. Through careful calibration, he transformed the fractured, chaotic, and war-torn galaxy into a series of interconnected minds capable of shared understanding and coordinated action. Leveraging his telepathy not as a tool of control, but as an instrument of strategic unity, that transcended the usual barriers of distrust, race, and ideology. Felt throughout the Warhammer 40K galaxy, it inevitably drew the attention of the Emperor of Mankind himself. From his throne on Terra, surrounded by the constant psychic resonance of the Golden Throne, the Emperor sensed the arrival of a mind both powerful and disciplined, radiating clarity and purpose unlike any other mortal or warp-touched being in the galaxy. Across the millennia, the Emperor had witnessed countless psychers rise and fall, some driven by ambition, others corrupted by the ruinous powers, and a few rare individuals whose abilities approached his own in scale, but lacked the depth of understanding or moral grounding he possessed. The presence of Professor X represented a psychic anomaly of unprecedented sophistication, a human mind capable of immense influence, guided by discipline, ethics, and an unshakable clarity of purpose. The Emperor's initial awareness was subtle, a ripple within the psychic feedback that he constantly monitored to safeguard humanity. Unlike other mortals whose thoughts could be swayed or whose powers were tainted by chaos, Professor X's mind was steadfast, resistant to corruption, and profoundly analytical. The Emperor could sense a mental architecture unlike anything he had observed before, a mind designed to comprehend, negotiate, and influence on both the individual and collective levels, all without succumbing to the hubris or emotional volatility that often undermined powerful psychers. This was a presence that demanded attention, not merely for its potential threat, but also for the possibilities it presented. Across Terra and the wider Imperium, the psychic ripple propagated, and those attuned to the Emperor's will began to interpret the anomaly. Librarians, high-ranking inquisitors, and members of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica reported unprecedented readings, a disciplined telepathic signature that seemed almost to harmonize with the Emperor's own psychic frequency rather than compete with it. The Emperor observed carefully, analyzing not just the raw power, but the intent and purpose that guided it. He could discern that Professor X was not merely a conduit of psychic energy, but a mind capable of ethical judgment, foresight, and strategic calculation, traits that were rare even among the most disciplined Imperial psychers. The Emperor's awareness prompted a series of internal evaluations across the highest levels of Imperial command. Questions arose regarding the potential alignment or threat posed by this new entity. Could such a mind be an asset to humanity, capable of guiding and coordinating forces against the endless tides of chaos, orcs, tyranids, and Xenos aggressors? Or could it represent a latent danger, a mind of such power that, if misaligned, it could challenge the Emperor's vision or inadvertently destabilize human dominance? The Imperium, guided by the Emperor's subtle mental probing, began to prepare contingencies, assessing the potential interactions and consequences of this unprecedented arrival. Professor X, aware that his presence had attracted the Emperor's attention, adjusted his approach accordingly. He understood the scale of what he was facing. The Emperor was not a mere mortal to be negotiated with, nor a simple adversary to be countered. He was the psychic and temporal linchpin of the Imperium, a being whose influence spanned millennia and whose awareness extended across entire star systems. Professor X approached the situation with his characteristic caution and intellect, seeking to project clarity, transparency, and non-hostility while subtly demonstrating the discipline and ethical grounding of his abilities. He reached out psychically, sending nuanced impressions of purpose, calm, and order, rather than attempting direct communication or control. Aware that the Emperor's awareness could detect even the most minor manipulation. From the Emperor's perspective, these impressions were intriguing. He sensed the vast potential of Professor X's mind, a disciplined telepath capable of influencing not only individuals, but entire networks of thought across species and factions, yet guided by reason and moral clarity. Unlike other psychers who often acted out of fear, ambition, or devotion to chaos-tainted powers, Professor X's presence was a rare anomaly, a human mind of unparalleled capability, operating in service of principles rather than selfish gain. The Emperor recognized that, if harnessed or aligned with his objectives, such a mind could become an extraordinary asset in the eternal struggle to preserve humanity and resist the encroaching forces of the warp. Despite the potential, the Emperor remained cautious. His awareness extended beyond mere detection. He could sense the nuances of thought, intention, and foresight embedded within Professor X's consciousness. He observed how the telepath assessed threats, guided allies, and coordinated actions without overt imposition of will. This level of discipline and ethical grounding was rare, and it demanded careful consideration before engagement. The Emperor had seen powerful psychers corrupted by even the slightest overreach or moral compromise. Here was a mind that demonstrated clarity, resilience, and judgment, qualities that were simultaneously reassuring and demanding of close observation. Across the galaxy, the perception of Professor X as a significant force grew, amplified by the Emperor's awareness. Imperial commanders and psychers, aware of their master's focus, began to recognize the anomaly's influence and adjust accordingly. Strategic plans and battle coordination began to reflect the subtle interventions of this disciplined telepathy. The Emperor's awareness ensured that these adaptations were monitored and guided, maintaining a balance between encouraging cooperation and preventing any inadvertent challenge to his authority. Professor X's presence, while independent, became intertwined with the broader psychic and strategic framework of the Imperium, operating in a delicate balance between autonomy and alignment with the overarching goals of humanity. The Emperor also contemplated the broader implications of this arrival. A human mind capable of sustaining such clarity and control over psychic influence was unprecedented. It represented a convergence of intellect, morality, and telepathic power that could reshape interactions not only within the Imperium, but across the galaxy's myriad factions. Professor X could act as a stabilizing force, fostering coordination among allies, mitigating the chaotic influence of the warp, and countering the machinations of chaos with subtle yet profound psychic interventions. The Emperor, perceiving these capabilities, recognized the potential for both synergy and disruption. He understood that engagement would require observation, patience, and careful calibration, ensuring that the telepath's extraordinary abilities were neither misdirected nor underestimated. As events continued to unfold, Professor X maintained a careful balance between demonstrating his potential and avoiding provocation. The Emperor's awareness of him acted as both a constraint and a guide, influencing the subtle choices in psychic projection, interaction with allies, and anticipation of threats. Their minds, though separated by scale, power, and purpose, were now linked through perception, with each observing, assessing, and adapting to the presence of the other. In this complex interplay, the galaxy itself became the stage upon which the possibilities of cooperation, conflict, and psychic resonance were poised to unfold in ways that neither human nor Imperium had previously experienced. As Professor X continued to navigate the grim and violent galaxy of Warhammer 40K, his presence inevitably drew the attention of the Chaos Gods themselves, those ancient entities who thrived on the emotions, fears, and ambitions of mortals and immortals alike. These beings, embodiments of the raw forces of the warp, sensed immediately that a unique mind had entered the galaxy, a human consciousness that radiated not only power but also exceptional clarity, discipline, and a rare moral integrity. To the Chaos Gods, who were accustomed to exploiting weakness, temptation, and corruption, this was an anomaly. They had spent eons twisting the desires of humans, Eldar, and even other powerful entities to their own ends. Yet here was a mind that appeared resistant to their influence, a mind capable of withstanding temptation, analyzing motives, and projecting its own will without succumbing to the seductive pull of excess. Fear or ambition, the first waves of psychic probing, were subtle but immediate. The Chaos Gods, through their demonic servants and mortal cultists, attempted to infiltrate Professor X's consciousness, seeking to detect hidden desires or ethical compromises that could be exploited. These probes, often overwhelming for ordinary mortals and even many powerful psychers, met with remarkable resistance. Professor X's mental discipline acted like a lattice of psychic shields, absorbing and deflecting their attempts while simultaneously observing the intent behind them. Unlike most minds, which might react with fear, anger, or desire when confronted by the ruinous powers, his mind remained steady, calmly assessing every intrusion and analyzing it for strategic countermeasures. Chaos, recognizing that conventional mental attacks would not suffice, escalated their efforts. Demons, often embodiments of specific emotional and moral vulnerabilities, were dispatched to challenge his psyche directly. These entities attempted to overwhelm him with fear, rage, and despair, creating psychic landscapes designed to destabilize and manipulate. Yet Professor X's mind, honed through decades of experience in controlling and navigating human consciousness, perceived the artificiality of these projections. He detected the patterns of manipulation, understood the emotional triggers they sought to exploit, and responded with precise countermeasures. By projecting calm, reason, and an unshakable moral center, he deflected their attacks and even turned some of the psychic energy back against the demons, disrupting their coherence and forcing them into retreat or confusion. The Chaos Gods themselves, observing through their minions, became increasingly intrigued and frustrated. They had never encountered a human mind that could so effectively resist their influence without faltering, one that could engage with the warp in such a controlled and purposeful manner. While many mortals were vulnerable to their manipulations, offering gateways for corruption and destruction, Professor X's telepathy acted as both shield and countermeasure, detecting and neutralizing their attempts with subtlety and efficiency. Each attempt at intrusion not only failed, but also provided him with deeper insight into their strategies, their patterns of influence, and the vulnerabilities of their mortal and alien agents. This engagement was not purely defensive. Professor X began to take a more active stance, projecting psychic influence in ways designed to preempt and counter the plans of chaos. Through careful observation of cultist networks, he anticipated uprisings and subverted them before they could destabilize human worlds. He reached into the minds of susceptible individuals, guiding their thoughts away from despair, ambition, or malevolent impulses, reducing the effectiveness of chaos infiltration. His interventions were subtle, invisible to the untrained eye, yet profoundly impactful, stabilizing populations and strategic positions in ways that even experienced Imperial agents found difficult to trace or understand. As confrontations escalated, the interplay between Professor X and the forces of chaos revealed a unique dynamic. Unlike other psychers who might succumb to arrogance or overreach, he maintained a constant awareness of his limitations and the consequences of his actions. He did not attempt to dominate or obliterate the minds of mortals indiscriminately. Instead, he exercised precision, targeting key threats and reinforcing resilience among those vulnerable to corruption. This approach frustrated chaos, who relied on chaos, fear, and moral weakness to advance their agendas. Each failed attempt to destabilize him or his sphere of influence was noted, catalogued, and exploited in subsequent maneuvers, giving him an ever-growing advantage in the psychic contest. The demonic armies and mortal cultists, while formidable individually, were undermined by his strategic telepathy. He could sense the hesitation, doubt, or conflicting motivations within these forces, and by subtly amplifying these fractures, he reduced their efficiency without direct confrontation. In battle, this translated into moments where entire cultist cells faltered, demons misaligned their attacks, or coordinated strikes failed due to unexpected confusion. Professor X's influence was not a blunt weapon, but a scalpel, precise and effective. operating on mental and emotional levels to counter the overwhelming power and aggression typically wielded by the ruinous powers, even as chaos escalated further. Attempting more sophisticated manipulations and sending higher-tier demonic entities to engage him directly, Professor X adapted. He detected the patterns underlying their actions, discerning the strategies of Tzeentch's manipulations, the fury of Khorne's assault, the despair-laden corruption of Nurgle, and the subtle seductions of Slaanesh. By understanding the distinct natures of each chaos god, he tailored his psychic responses, counteracting the specific forms of influence each attempted to impose. He projected resilience, clarity, and foresight into key individuals and populations, creating a psychic ripple that reduced the impact of corruption and maintained operational stability even in the midst of extreme hostility. Through these engagements, Professor X not only resisted the ruinous powers, but began to establish a framework for broader defense against them. His influence created pockets of stability in areas where chaos had long dominated, coordinating responses among psychers, commanders, and strategic leaders in ways that chaos could not easily anticipate. He became a focal point of resistance, a human mind capable of contesting the ruinous powers on both psychic and strategic levels, leveraging his discipline, foresight, and moral clarity to counter centuries of accumulated influence and corruption. In every interaction, the forces of chaos were forced to adapt to an entirely new paradigm. No longer could they rely on fear, weakness, or ambition alone to manipulate their targets. Professor X's presence introduced an unprecedented variable into the psychic landscape of the galaxy, one that challenged their assumptions, disrupted their plans, and redefined the boundaries of what a single human mind could achieve against the infinite and insidious reach of the warp. As Professor X's presence became more prominent across the Warhammer 40K galaxy, the ripple effects of his interventions began to transform the way entire campaigns and conflicts were conducted. He had already established his influence among individual psychers, military leaders, and even alien civilizations. But the scale of his impact continued to grow as he learned to operate strategically on the galactic stage. Unlike most psychers, whose abilities were often reactive or limited to combat situations, Professor X had the foresight and tactical intelligence to assess multi-layered threats and coordinate responses across vast distances. Every action he took, every mental projection, and every intervention was measured, precise, and guided by a deep understanding of both human and alien psychology, as well as the broader currents of war and political intrigue that shaped the galaxy. He began to observe the larger structures of power and conflict, identifying patterns in the movements of armies, fleets, and psychers that spanned the Imperium and its numerous adversaries. His telepathy allowed him to perceive the intentions, fears, and motivations of leaders, commanders, and influential figures simultaneously, providing him with a unique perspective on the interconnected nature of war in this universe. By understanding not only what factions intended to do, but also why they made the decisions they did, he could anticipate shifts in strategy, preempt potential disasters, and subtly guide events toward more favorable outcomes without imposing direct control. In dealing with the Imperium, he found that his influence could amplify the effectiveness of even the most disciplined units. Space Marine chapters, particularly librarians, responded to his subtle psychic guidance with enhanced coordination and perception, able to anticipate threats, respond to dynamic battlefield conditions, and coordinate actions across squads with unprecedented precision. Entire regiments of the Imperial Guard experienced moments of clarity and insight, as if they were subtly aware of dangers before they emerged and could act decisively without waiting for orders. Professor X's interventions created a ripple effect, improving morale, strategic coordination, and battlefield efficiency in ways that were difficult to quantify, but immediately apparent in combat outcomes. At the same time, he began interacting more directly with alien factions. The Eldar, long accustomed to manipulating probabilities and predicting futures through psychic foresight, were intrigued by his disciplined approach. Farseers and seers observed that his telepathy could complement their own abilities, enhancing predictions, coordinating preemptive strategies, and improving responses to threats from chaos or other hostile races. By subtly aligning human and Eldar objectives, he was able to create temporary alliances and cooperative maneuvers that would have been nearly impossible without his guidance, allowing for strategic victories in regions where competing agendas had previously prevented collaboration. Professor X's encounters with orcs and tyranids also continued to evolve. While he could not reason with these species in the traditional sense, he could influence their behavior by exploiting instinct, aggression, and collective coordination. Orc warbands were subtly misdirected to clash with each other or expend their energy in ineffective assaults, reducing threats to civilian populations and strategic locations. Tyranid swarms, directed by the hive mind, were subtly disrupted, creating hesitation and misalignment within their ranks, which allowed human and allied forces to respond more effectively. These interventions were careful and precise, altering the course of engagements without provoking catastrophic retaliation or drawing undue attention. Beyond individual encounters and battlefield strategy, Professor X began to recognize the larger systemic challenges facing the galaxy. The forces of chaos, for example, relied on fear, ambition, and moral weakness to corrupt and destabilize populations. By projecting subtle psychic guidance and reinforcement of moral clarity, he reduced susceptibility to corruption, countered the influence of cults, and reinforced resilience in both civilian and military populations. His interventions created nodes of stability and resistance across the Imperium and allied systems, establishing a foundation upon which coordinated defenses and proactive strategies could be built. Professor X's interactions with the Emperor of Mankind also became increasingly significant. The Emperor, aware of his presence and abilities, monitored his actions closely. Professor X's disciplined and ethical approach allowed him to operate without triggering the Emperor's suspicion or defensive instincts. Instead, his actions were interpreted as potentially synergistic, creating opportunities for alignment with imperial objectives without directly challenging the authority or psychic dominance of the Emperor. This delicate balance allowed him to operate on a scale that few other mortals could hope to achieve, leveraging his abilities to influence galactic events while maintaining autonomy and ethical integrity. The forces of chaos, aware of his presence, escalated their attempts to undermine his influence, deploying demons, corrupted psychers, and mortal cults to test the limits of his mental defenses. Yet each attempt met with a combination of preemptive anticipation, defensive mental barriers, and strategic redirection. Professor X's understanding of the individual and collective psychology of his adversaries allowed him to turn many of their efforts against them, creating confusion, hesitation, and misalignment within their ranks. His ability to perceive both the micro-level intentions of individuals and the macro-level strategies of factions allowed him to neutralize threats that would have overwhelmed conventional forces. In addition to combat and strategic interventions, Professor X began to foster broader networks of communication and coordination among allied forces. By linking psychers, commanders, and influential figures across species and factions, he created an informal web of insight and guidance that allowed for rapid adaptation and coordinated responses to emerging threats. These networks, while subtle and largely invisible to external observers, significantly enhanced the resilience and effectiveness of human and allied forces, countering the usual advantages held by chaotic or disunited opponents. Through continuous observation, adaptation, and intervention, Professor X became a central figure in reshaping the dynamics of power and conflict in the Warhammer 40K galaxy. His presence created new opportunities for coordination, strategic foresight, and resistance to corruption, influencing outcomes on scales ranging from individual battles to planetary and even interstellar campaigns. His disciplined telepathy, ethical guidance, and strategic acumen established him as a unique force capable of operating within the complex web of political, military, and psychic interactions that define the galaxy, redefining the limits of human potential in a universe dominated by war, chaos, and alien intelligence.